Bear River Valley, Wyoming, October 1889. The wind already had the teeth of winter in it, a dry, scouring cold that promised misery to come. Along the river bottom, the cottonwoods were skeletons, their yellow leaves stripped and scattered. Most men were chinking the gaps in their log cabins, banking earth against the foundations, their movements hurried by the memory of the previous year. But Trevina Pengali was doing something else entirely. He was trying to build a house out of a giant iron tube. The thing was a retired boiler shell, 12 feet in diameter and 20 feet long, hauled by a groaning team of 16 oxen from the Union Pacific scrapyard in Evanston. It now lay on a low stone foundation on Pengali's claim, a colossal, rust-streaked cylinder that looked like a piece of a wrecked ironclad warship dropped into the sagebrush. To the other settlers, it was an obscenity against common sense. Hollis Bramwell, a locomotive fitter for the railroad and a man whose opinion on metal carried weight, stood with his arms crossed, a small crowd of neighbors beside him. "What in God's name is the man thinking, Jedediah?" he muttered to Jedediah Coombs, a rancher whose cabin was a model of tight-coped joinery. "He calls it a dwelling," Coombs said, shaking his head. "Says it'll be warm." "Warm?" Bramwell let out a short, sharp laugh. "It's a quarter-inch of iron, Silas. It'll sweat ice on the inside from a man's breath. It'll be a tomb. The man is foolish." Silas Pritchett, who had lost 24 head of cattle to a blizzard last February, nodded grimly. "He's Cornish, ain't he? They live underground." "Maybe he doesn't know any better." From inside the echoing shell came the rhythmic scrape and clink of a trowel on brick. Pengali was working, oblivious or indifferent to their judgment. He emerged a moment later, his face smudged with mortar dust, and began to unload a wagon of fire brick. He was a compact man with the thick shoulders and forearms of someone who'd spent a lifetime working with heavy tools in tight spaces. He gave the onlookers a brief, neutral nod and went back to his labor. Bramwell couldn't resist. He strode closer. "Pengali, that iron is going to get so brittle in the cold, the rivets will pop in the first hard freeze. The seams will vent your firebox and fill the whole shell with smoke. You'll suffocate your family in that damned thing." Trevina Pengali paused, setting a brick carefully onto its bed of mortar. He looked at the locomotive fitter, his eyes calm. "The iron is the weather skin, Mr. Bramwell," he said, his Cornish accent clipping the words, "not the comfort." He turned back to his wall, and the scraping of the trowel resumed. The conversation was over. The mockery, however, was just beginning. What did this Cornish boiler rigger, this outsider with calloused hands and a quiet tongue, understand about radiative re-emission that a professional locomotive fitter, an expert in the physics of steam and pressure, had missed? What secret was held in the simple, perfect geometry of a curve? Before we see how this iron monster saved his family from a winter that broke other, wiser men, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. I'm not just going to tell you a story. I promise you will learn the fundamental principle of thermal mass and how a simple shape can defeat the most brutal cold. Let me know in the comments, what's the strangest material you've ever seen someone use to build a house? Trevina Pengali was not a carpenter. He was not a stonemason. And he was certainly not a frontiersman in the Wyoming sense. He was a lagger. In the deep tin mines of Cornwall, he had spent 20 years of his life in the hot, damp dark, cladding the great stationary steam boilers that drove the pumps and man engines. His tools were not the axe and the adze, but the trowel, the wire snips, and the mallet. His materials were not logs and mud, but asbestos plaster, felted wool, magnesia blocks, and sheet iron. His entire trade was built on a single, vital principle: keeping the heat where it was meant to be. A boiler's job was to make steam, and every degree of temperature that bled out into the surrounding rock was wasted coal, wasted effort, wasted money. His hands knew the language of insulation, of sealed joints and non-conductive layers. He had come to Wyoming with his wife, Morwenna, and their 2 young sons, Jago and Lowen, for the promise of land and air that didn't taste of coal dust and damp earth. They arrived with enough money for a claim and a team, and like everyone else, they built a cabin. It was a sturdy, respectable structure of lodgepole pine, tightly chinked with mud and moss, and in their first Wyoming winter, it had nearly killed them. That winter was a lesson in a new kind of physics. The cold was not the passive damp of a Cornish winter. It was an active, predatory force. The stovepipes howled with a wind that seemed to blow straight down from the Arctic Circle, a physical pressure against the walls. Inside, despite a fire in the cast-iron stove that burned red-hot day and night, their boots froze to the puncheon floor if left in a corner. Morwenna would set a pot of soup to cool on the table, and 6 feet from the roaring stove, a thin skin of ice would form on its surface, before it was even lukewarm. In the mornings, the wicks in the brass lanterns were stiff with frozen kerosene, the flames sputtering to life reluctantly. The logs of the cabin walls, solid as they seemed, were conduits for the cold. The frost built up on the nail heads inside, white flowers of misery that marked every point where the outside world was touching their shelter. Trevina burned through their entire winter's supply of wood by January, and spent the next 2 months venturing into the wind-scoured hills, felling dead timber and hauling it back, his body aching with a cold that settled deep in his bones. He watched his sons, huddled in blankets, their faces pinched and pale. He saw the quiet fear in Morwenna's eyes. This wasn't living, it was a siege, and they were losing. The problem wasn't the fire, he realized. They had plenty of fire. The problem was the house. It was a sieve for heat. The failure of the conventional frontier cabin was not a failure of craftsmanship, but a failure of thermal dynamics. A log, no matter how thick, is still a relatively poor insulator. A 12-inch pine log has an R value of about 15. A modern, well-insulated wall has an R value of 19 to 25. But the real enemy was not conduction through the wood itself. It was infiltration and thermal bridging. Every gap in the chinking, every seam around the door and window frames was an open wound. The ferocious Wyoming wind exploited these gaps, forcing cold, dense air in and pushing precious warm air out. This constant air exchange meant the stove was not heating a contained space, it was attempting to heat the entire Bear River Valley. The heat it produced rose to the ceiling and, finding the path of least resistance, flowed right out through the roof and walls. Furthermore, the very structure of the cabin worked against itself. The nails and spikes used in its construction, the stone of the fireplace, any metal hinges or latches. These were thermal bridges, direct highways for heat to escape. The frost that bloomed on the nail heads was physical proof of this process. Each nail was a tiny, efficient radiator, sucking warmth from the interior air and dumping it into the frozen log outside. For neighbors like the Pritchett family, this meant a life tethered to the stove. Their children, Martha and Samuel, lived in a small radius of warmth, wrapped in quilts, while the corners of their single-room cabin remained perpetually at or below freezing. They burned cord after cord of wood, a resource that required immense physical labor to procure, only to watch its energy vanish into the wind. The central problem, the one Trevina Pengali understood from his years in the mines, was radiation. A hot stove radiates thermal energy in all directions. In a square cabin, that energy strikes the flat walls and is either conducted through them or reflected away. Much of it is simply lost. The walls themselves become cold surfaces that in turn radiate cold back towards the occupants, chilling them even when the air temperature is reasonable. The house was fighting the fire. It was an impossible, exhausting battle. Trevina knew he couldn't win by building a bigger fire. He had to build a better container. The work began in late summer. The journey to Evanston to find the boiler was the first challenge. He'd heard of a boneyard where the Union Pacific Railroad discarded its old equipment. He spent 2 days walking the yard, stepping over retired rails and broken couplings, until he found it. A massive fire tube boiler from an old stationary engine, decommissioned and sold for scrap. It was perfect. He paid the yard boss $35 for the shell, a fortune he'd scraped together from selling hay. Getting it back to the valley was an epic of its own, requiring the help of 2 neighbors he paid in cured pork and a combined team of 16 oxen. They dragged it on massive log skids, the iron cylinder groaning and screeching over the rough terrain. This was the source of the first whispers, the first looks of pity and concern. Once on his claim, Trevina began the real work. He and his sons cleared and leveled a patch of ground, then laid a circular foundation of flat river stones, mortared together. Upon this, with levers, rollers, and the last of his strength, he positioned the shell. It sat like a strange iron egg in the vast landscape. Then came the part no one understood. He began building another wall inside the boiler. Using hundreds of fire bricks he'd also bought from the railroad, discards from engine fireboxes, he meticulously constructed a 6-inch thick circular wall, leaving a 4-inch gap between the brick and the inner surface of the iron shell. It was slow, painstaking work. Jago and Lowen helped him mix the fireclay mortar, their small hands covered in the pale gray dust. Morwenna brought them food and water, her expression a mixture of profound trust and quiet apprehension. "It will look a strange thing, Trevina," she said one evening, her voice soft. "It will be a warm thing, my love," he replied, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "That is all that matters." This was when Hollis Bramwell and the others began to make their daily visits, watching the strange construction with a kind of morbid fascination. As Trevina left a space for a door and 2 small windows, Bramwell made his confident pronouncement about the rivets popping in the cold. He explained, with the authority of a man who serviced the most powerful machines in the territory, that the expansion and contraction of dissimilar metals, the iron shell and the steel rivets, would shear the fasteners as the temperature plunged. It was a logical, experience-based argument. Trevina simply nodded. "The iron will not see the worst of the cold," was his only reply. Once the inner brick wall was complete, he began the dustiest job of all. He had his sons haul bucket after bucket of fine, dry sand from the riverbank. He poured the sand into the 4-inch gap between the brick and the iron, using a long pole to tamp it down, ensuring every void was filled. He was creating a sand annulus, a complete, unbroken layer of insulation. The neighbors saw only a man filling a perfectly good iron tank with useless dirt. They shook their heads and walked away, their certainty of his madness now complete. Finally, he installed a small, efficient cast-iron stove near the center of the circular room. But he did not run the stovepipe straight up and out. Instead, he routed the metal flue upwards and then horizontally, running it almost the full length of the interior dome before it exited through a heavily sealed thimble at the far end. He was forcing the hot exhaust gases to travel the length of the dwelling, giving them the maximum possible time to radiate their heat into the structure before escaping. He installed a small, baffled fresh air intake near the stove, and a tiny exhaust vent at the peak of the dome, creating a slow, controlled circulation of air. By the time the first snows flew, the Pengali family had moved in. The interior was Spartan, 2 beds at one end, a table and chairs at the other. But it was sealed, finished, and ready. The mockery from the valley had lasted 3 months. The validation would be delivered by the first great storm of winter. To understand why Trevina Pengali's iron tube worked, you have to unlearn how a normal house stays warm. A conventional cabin fights a defensive war against the cold, constantly losing heat that must be replaced by a fire. Pengali's boiler home fought an offensive war, capturing, storing, and endlessly recycling heat. The secret was the physics of radiative re-emission, amplified by the geometry of a curve. Everything with a temperature above absolute zero radiates thermal energy. A hot stove doesn't just heat the air around it through convection. It radiates infrared energy in straight lines like light from a bulb. In a square room, this energy travels until it hits a flat wall. The wall absorbs some energy, conducts it to the outside, and loses it forever. The rest is reflected, but in a chaotic, inefficient pattern. Inside Pengali's structure, something entirely different happened. The process started with the stove. Its radiant heat traveled outwards and struck the dense, 6-inch thick wall of fire brick. Fire brick is a material with high thermal mass, meaning it can absorb and hold a tremendous amount of heat energy. It warmed up slowly, but once warm, it held that energy for a very long time. This is where the magic began. The warmed fire brick wall now became a radiator itself. But because it was a concave curve, it did not radiate its heat outwards into nothingness. It radiated its heat inwards, towards the center of the room. Every single point on the interior curved surface was radiating energy toward every other point on the curved surface, as well as towards the family inside. The heat energy was focused, concentrated, and shared in a continuous, gentle exchange. It was like being inside the reflector of a lantern. This effect was compounded by the layers. The outer skin was the quarter-inch iron shell. Its purpose was singular, to be an absolute impermeable barrier to wind and moisture. No draft could penetrate it. The 4-inch layer of packed, dry sand was the primary insulation. Sand is a surprisingly effective insulator because it traps countless tiny pockets of air, preventing convective heat loss. It acted as a buffer, ensuring the precious heat stored in the fire brick could not easily escape to the iron shell. The iron, therefore, never got truly cold enough to become brittle or pop its rivets, just as Trevina had predicted. It was protected by the sand. The long horizontal stovepipe was the final masterstroke. A standard vertical pipe is an escape route for heat. By extending the flue, he created a massive secondary radiator. The hot gases, which might have been 200 or 300 degrees Fahrenheit, spent 3 times as long inside the living space, their heat radiating down from the ceiling, warming the upper air and the brick dome before exiting. A single cord of wood burned in a conventional cabin might produce millions of BTUs, but 80% of them would be lost through the walls, roof, and chimney within an hour. In Pengali's boiler, that same cord of wood's energy was captured by the fire brick. The stove could be allowed to die down to coals, but the brick, now a massive thermal battery, would continue to radiate steady, even warmth, for 8, 10, even 12 hours. The family wasn't living off the fire. They were living off the memory of the fire, stored in the walls around them. That winter, the weather turned biblical. It wasn't a steady cold, but a series of violent oscillations known as a Wyoming Chinook collapse. For days, the weather would be unnaturally warm, with a soft, moist wind melting the snow and turning the valley to mud. Temperatures would rise to a balmy 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Then, in the space of a single afternoon, the wind would shift. The sky would turn a hard, metallic gray, and the temperature would plummet. In a few hours, it would drop 70 degrees, from plus 38 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit. The wet ground would flash freeze into iron-hard ruts. The wind would return with savage force, driving snow horizontally. This cycle repeated 14 times over 9 weeks. For the settlers in their log cabins, it was a special kind of hell. The rapid expansion and contraction of the logs opened up chinks and seams. The mud daubing softened by the Chinook would freeze and crumble, letting the wind shriek through the walls. The Pritchett's cabin became almost unlivable. The wind found a new gap near their chimney, and no matter how they stuffed it with rags, a knife edge of Arctic air sliced into the room. Their water barrel, 6 feet from the stove, froze solid. Hollis Bramwell, for all his expertise, fared little better. His well-built home was tight, but the sheer conductive power of the cold overwhelmed it. He burned through his woodpile at an alarming rate, the stove glowing cherry red while the windows were opaque with an inch of interior frost. The temperature swings made the very air feel thin and sharp, a hostile presence inside his own home. He began to worry about having enough fuel to last until spring. Inside the Pengali's boiler, there was stillness. The wind, howling at 60 miles per hour outside, was only a distant, muted roar. The iron shell took the full force of the gale, but inside a candle flame on their table barely flickered. The temperature remained almost constant. During the day, Trevina would keep a small, steady fire going in the stove. The fire brick walls soaked up the heat. At night, he would bank the stove, and the bricks would begin their slow, silent work. The interior temperature never dropped below 62 degrees. The domestic reality of this stability was profound. Morwenna could do her mending without her fingers growing stiff. The boys, Jago and Lowen, could play on the wooden floor in their stocking feet, their world no longer confined to the dangerous circle around a red-hot stove. The air was warm, but also dry. The iron shell, being a perfect vapor barrier, prevented the damp chill that plagued the log cabins. One evening, as the wind screamed outside, Morwenna was humming a Cornish tune while rolling out dough for a pasty on the wooden table. The butter for the dough was soft. That simple fact, butter soft on the table in the middle of a Wyoming blizzard, was the ultimate proof. The cold had been defeated. They weren't surviving. They were living. The vindication came on the coldest day of the year. The temperature had dropped to minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit in the valley bottom, and the air was so still and dense it hurt to breathe. Up on the high grade where the Union Pacific tracks cut across the ridge, Hollis Bramwell was in trouble. The extreme cold had found a weakness in his locomotive's boiler. A fire tube, stressed by the pressure and the temperature differential, had blown. With a deafening roar, a jet of steam and boiling water erupted into the firebox, extinguishing the fire and crippling the engine. The train, a short freight run, was stranded. There was no choice. Bramwell had to get to the settlement to organize a repair crew and use the blacksmith's forge. He bundled himself in every layer he owned and began the 3-mile walk down the grade. The cold was shocking, a physical weight that seemed to crush the air from his lungs. The metal of the rails contracted with loud bangs like pistol shots. The oil in his pocket watch, a fine Hamilton he kept meticulously maintained, began to thicken. As he descended into the valley, the wind picked up, a brutal, scouring force that drove ice crystals into his exposed skin. He pulled his scarf over his face, his breath freezing instantly on the wool. He was walking through a world of noise, the shriek of the wind, the crunch of his boots on the brittle snow, the frantic pounding of his own heart. Then, as he approached the Pengali claim, something strange happened. The noise of the wind in his ears lessened, then almost disappeared. He looked up and saw the absurd, rust-colored curve of the boiler house. He was in its lee, but it was more than that. There was an area of profound calm extending 20 feet from the structure. He walked towards the simple wooden door, stepping into a bubble of silence. The gale still raged over his head, but here, at ground level, the air was still. He knew he had to get warm, if only for a moment. He was a proud man, but pride was a poor shield against this cold. He knocked on the door. After a moment, it swung open. Trevina Pengali stood there, silhouetted against a soft, warm light. Bramwell braced himself for the blast of frigid, smoky air he expected from the interior of any cabin, the inevitable result of opening a door in this weather. He expected to feel the cold. Instead, a gentle, silent wave of pure warmth washed over him, so profound and unexpected it made him gasp. It wasn't the scorching, dry heat of a stove, but a pervasive, radiant warmth that seemed to come from every direction at once. He stepped inside. The air was still. It was quiet. It smelled faintly of baked bread and clean wool. The two boys were on the floor, assembling a small wooden puzzle. He looked at the stove. It was barely ticking over, a low fire slumbering within. There was no frost on the small windows. He fumbled in his coat, his fingers numb, and pulled out his watch. He held it in his palm. The thick, congealed oil had nearly stopped the mechanism. The second hand was struggling, ticking in spasmodic jerks. He held it there, in the middle of the room. He watched, fascinated, as the warmth of the space began to penetrate the metal casing. After a minute, the second hand gave a little shudder, then began to move again, ticking smoothly, cleanly, sweeping around the dial in a perfect, uninterrupted circle. The proof was absolute, held in the palm of his hand. His watch oil, frozen to uselessness on a multi-ton locomotive, flowed freely inside this simple iron shell. He looked at Trevina, his face pale in the lantern light. All his certainty, all his professional confidence had shattered. He finally understood. "You didn't build a house, Trevina," Hollis Bramwell said, his voice full of awe. "You built a lung. It holds its own breath." Hollis Bramwell became Trevina Pengali's most fervent advocate. He was a man of science and mechanics, and when he explained what he had seen, people listened. He didn't talk about magic. He talked about thermodynamics. He described the still air, the even heat, the undeniable evidence of his watch. He told Silas Pritchett that Pengali was burning half the wood and getting twice the warmth. He explained to Jedediah Coombs that the curved walls focused the heat, that it was a principle of engineering, not madness. The story of the Cornish oven spread through the valley. That spring, when the thaw finally came, a procession of curious settlers made their way to Pengali's claim. He welcomed them all, patiently answering their questions, never once mentioning the mockery of the previous fall. He showed them the layers, explained the purpose of the sand, the fire brick, the long flue. He shared his knowledge freely. The idea took root. That summer, the scrap dealer in Evanston noticed a strange new trend. Men from the Bear River Valley were coming in, not for sheet iron or old rails, but specifically asking for decommissioned boiler shells. The dealer, a shrewd man named Abernathy, quickly put two and two together. He started setting aside the best shells, chalking Pengali work on their sides and charging a premium. By October of 1890, 6 other families in the valley had built their own boiler houses, with Trevina Pengali himself offering advice on their construction. The landscape began to be dotted with the strange, beautiful curves of repurposed iron, each one a testament to an idea that worked. The simple frontier innovation of a Cornish boiler rigger anticipated, by nearly a century, some of the most advanced principles of modern building science. The concept of a super-insulated, airtight envelope is the bedrock of the German Passive House Standard, the most rigorous energy efficiency certification in the world. The use of dense interior materials to absorb and re-radiate heat is the core principle of thermal mass heating, now used in high-end, energy-efficient homes. Trevina Pengali, with no formal training in architecture or physics, had intuitively grasped the fundamentals of radiant heat transfer and created a shelter that performed better than many structures built today. His work was a quiet rebuke to the accepted wisdom of his time. There is a deep and satisfying logic to it all. A vessel built to hold pressure already knew how to hold warmth. The engineering challenge was the same: containment. For decades, that iron shell had been designed to withstand the violent, expansive force of steam at hundreds of pounds per square inch. Its riveted seams, its cylindrical shape, its very material integrity were all optimized to prevent energy from escaping. Trevina Pengali simply recognized that the gentle, radiant energy of a small wood stove was governed by the same physical laws. He did not invent a new principle. He merely looked at an old object and saw its true nature. The frontier didn't reward what was traditional. It rewarded what worked. A shape designed to hold the power that drove the industrial world was repurposed to hold the simple, sacred warmth of a family's home. If you found this story of ingenuity as fascinating as I did, please like this video and subscribe for more tales of forgotten history and practical wisdom. And let me know in the comments, what modern technology do you think is being used for the wrong purpose, just waiting for someone to see its true potential? Thanks for watching. The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes. The events, characters, and names depicted are fictionalized for narrative effect, though the technical principles and historical context are based on real practices. The construction techniques described are historical and may not meet modern building codes or safety standards. Any application of these principles should be undertaken with professional guidance and in compliance with all current laws and regulations. This video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.